In the bone-crushing silence of -67 degrees Fahrenheit, Ayana Borisova's breath froze before it left her lips, each exhale creating tiny crystals that fell like snow to the wooden floor of the animal shelter. The generator had died 3 hours ago, and she could hear the desperate whimpers growing weaker behind the kennel doors. Outside, the Yakutian winter howled with the fury of ancient spirits, and everyone else in the village of Batagay had either evacuated or retreated to their warmest rooms with their families. Everyone except Ayana, who sat cross-legged on the floor, her thick reindeer-hide coat wrapped around a shivering 3-legged dog named Misha, watching the thermometer on the wall drop degree by degree toward a temperature that would kill them all. The radio had been broadcasting evacuation warnings for 2 days straight, but Ayana had made her choice the moment she saw the fear in the animals' eyes when the other volunteers packed up and left. 37 dogs, 11 cats, 4 rabbits, and 1 ancient Arctic fox named Nanook, who'd been rejected by every family in the region because of his aggressive temperament and scarred face. They couldn't understand why the warmth was disappearing, why the humans who fed them were abandoning them one by one, why their water bowls had turned to solid ice despite being inside what was supposed to be their sanctuary. Ayana had grown up in these temperatures, the daughter of a traditional Yakut hunter who taught her that survival was untied about having the best equipment or the warmest shelter. It was about understanding cold as a living thing, respecting it, and finding ways to work with it instead of against it. Her grandmother had survived the siege of Leningrad, and her great-grandmother had lived through famines that killed entire villages. Survival was in her DNA, but more than that, it was her responsibility. She had volunteered at this shelter for 8 years, ever since she was 16, and these animals had become her family in a way that her actual relatives, scattered across Russia and beyond, had never been. The shelter director, Viktor Petrov, had begged her to leave with the rest of the staff that morning, offering to drive her to the emergency warming center in Verkhoyansk, 60 kilometers away. But Ayana knew that even if some of the animals survived the cold for a few days, they would die of dehydration, fear, and starvation long before anyone could return. The weather reports were calling it a once-in-a-century freeze, the kind of Arctic blast that could last for weeks and had historically killed entire settlements. She had sent Victor away with a lie, telling him she was waiting for her cousin to pick her up in his truck, and then she had methodically prepared for what she knew would be either her greatest act of love or her final act on Earth. She had moved all the animals into the main room, creating a tight circle of kennels and carriers around the center of the space where she could monitor them all. She had gathered every blanket, towel, and piece of fabric in the building, layering them over the cages and creating a makeshift fort that would trap whatever body heat they could generate together. The first night had been manageable. She had shared her own body heat with the smallest animals, rotating between carriers and kennels, keeping them active with gentle exercise and feeding them extra portions to help their bodies generate warmth. She had melted snow over candles to provide drinking water and had burned every piece of scrap wood she could find in a small emergency fireplace that barely provided enough heat for one person, let alone an entire room full of animals. By the second night, her fingers had started going numb even inside her thick gloves, and she could feel the telltale tingling in her toes that warned of frostbite. The animals had grown quieter, conserving energy, but she could see in their eyes that they trusted her to find a solution. Nanook, the scarred Arctic fox who had never let any human touch him, had pressed himself against the bars of his cage closest to where she sat, seeking her warmth and presence. The third night was when everything changed. Ayana had been dozing fitfully against a pile of dog beds, trying to share her body heat with as many animals as possible, when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze colder than the air around her. It was a low, steady scratching at the outer door of the shelter, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing. Her first thought was that Victor had returned, or perhaps another villager had come to check on the building, but then she heard it again, a sound too rhythmic, too persistent to be human. Bears didn't usually hunt in temperatures this extreme, but a starving bear might be desperate enough to investigate any structure that might contain food. Wolves were a possibility too, or even worse, a pack of feral dogs driven to desperation by the cold and hunger. Ayana's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that not only were she and the animals trapped by the deadly cold, but something dangerous was now stalking them from outside. She moved carefully through her makeshift animal sanctuary, checking the locks on the doors and windows, grateful that the shelter had been built with security in mind. The scratching continued, and she could hear whatever was outside moving around the perimeter of the building, testing different entry points. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see nothing but white darkness. But the sounds told her that there were multiple creatures out there, working together with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. The animals in the shelter had gone completely silent. Even the usually vocal cats pressed low in their carriers with their ears flattened. Only Nanook remained alert, his golden eyes fixed on the door, his scarred muzzle pulled back in a silent snarl. For the first time since she had known him, the aggressive fox seemed less like a threat and more like a guardian, positioning himself between the door and the smaller animals. As the fourth night fell and the scratching sounds grew more persistent, Ayana realized that her plan to wait out the freeze had become something much more complicated. The temperature inside the shelter was now dropping fast enough that her breath formed clouds that lingered in the air, and she knew that without some source of heat, they would all be dead by morning. She had already burned every piece of wood, every cardboard box, and every paper document in the building. Her candles were nearly gone, and the small emergency radio had died hours earlier when its batteries froze solid. That's when she remembered the old stories her grandmother used to tell about the siege of Leningrad, about how people survived impossible circumstances by making impossible choices. Her grandmother had spoken of burning furniture, books, and eventually even floorboards to stay alive. But more importantly, she had talked about how survival sometimes meant becoming something you never thought you could be. Ayana looked around at the animals, depending on her creatures who had been abandoned, neglected, and given up on by humans who were supposed to care for them. She thought about her own life, working 2 jobs to support the shelter, living alone in a small apartment, spending every weekend and holiday caring for animals that most people considered disposable. She had never married, never had children, never built the kind of life that most people would consider successful or meaningful. But here, in this moment, surrounded by creatures who trusted her completely, she understood that this was what she had been meant to do. The scratching outside had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow more frightening than the sounds had been. Ayana pressed her face to the window, wiping away the frost with her glove, and what she saw in the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow made her gasp. It wasn't bears or wolves or feral dogs that had been stalking the shelter. It was people, for figures in heavy winter gear, standing in a rough semicircle around the building, just watching. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Rescue had come. Victor must have convinced someone to check on her, or perhaps the emergency services had finally been able to get through. She stumbled toward the door, her frozen fingers fumbling with the locks, ready to shout her gratitude and help load the animals into whatever vehicles they had brought. But as she cracked open the door and the brutal cold hit her face like a physical blow, something in the posture of the figures outside made her freeze. They weren't moving toward the building or calling out to her. They were just standing there, perfectly still in temperatures that should have killed any human being in minutes. And now that she could see them more clearly, she realized that their winter gear was wrong, too thin, too old-fashioned, and somehow too clean for people who had just traveled through a deadly blizzard. One of the figures raised its head, and in the moonlight, Ayana could see that, where there should have been a face, there was only shadow beneath the hood. Not the shadow of features obscured by cold weather gear, but actual shadow, as if the darkness itself was wearing human clothing. The figure tilted its head in a gesture that was almost curious, almost amused, and then it spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the wind itself. "You could have left them," the shadow figure said in perfect Yakut, the language of her childhood that she hadn't heard spoken in months. "You could have saved yourself and lived a long life. Why do you choose to die for creatures that cannot even speak your name?" Ayana's grip tightened on the door handle, every instinct screaming at her to slam it shut and barricade herself inside. But something deeper than fear kept her standing there. She had grown up on stories of spirits and ancient beings, creatures that tested human hearts in moments of extreme hardship. Her grandmother had warned her that the taiga was full of entities that watched how people behaved when they thought no one was looking, that judged the true character of human souls, because they would do the same for me, she heard herself say, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Because someone needs to care about the ones who can't care for themselves. The shadow figure was quiet for a long moment, and Ayana could feel the weight of its attention like a physical pressure against her chest. Behind her she could hear the animals beginning to stir, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening. And she realized that Nanook had positioned himself right at her feet, his small body radiating protective warmth against her legs. "Show us," another of the figures said, its voice like ice cracking on a frozen river. "Show us how you love them when loving them costs you everything." The figures began to move then. Not toward her but in a slow circle around the shelter, and as they moved Ayana felt the temperature continue to plummet. Her breath was coming in short, sharp puffs that crystallized instantly, and she could feel her exposed skin beginning to burn with cold. She knew, with absolute certainty, that this was a test, and that the lives of all the animals behind her depended on how she responded. She could step back inside, lock the door, and try to wait it out, hoping that the figures would eventually leave and that rescue would come in time. She could try to negotiate, to bargain for safe passage for herself and the animals. Or she could do what her grandmother had always taught her to do when faced with forces beyond human understanding. She could show them the truth of who she was through her actions rather than her words. Ayana stepped fully outside into the killing cold, closing the door behind her to keep what little warmth remained trapped inside with the animals. The figures stopped their circling and turned to face her, for shadows in human clothing watching her with attention that felt ancient and patient. The cold was so intense that she could feel her lungs burning with each breath, and she knew she had perhaps minutes before hypothermia would make her decision for her. But instead of trying to explain herself or plead for mercy, she began to sing. It was a song her grandmother had taught her, a traditional Yakut melody about the spirits of animals and the responsibility of humans to protect the helpless. Her voice cracked with cold and fear, but she sang every verse. even as her lips began to go numb and her fingers started to lose feeling inside her gloves. As she sang, something extraordinary began to happen. The brutal cold that had been pressing against her like a living thing began to ease, not warming exactly, but becoming less hostile, more neutral. The shadow figures drew closer and she could see that they were listening intently, their attention focused completely on her words and the emotion behind them. When she finished the song, the largest of the figures stepped forward and spoke in a voice that now sounded less like wind and more like an old woman, tired but not unkind. "We have watched this place for many seasons," it said. "We have seen humans come and go, some caring, some indifferent, some cruel. We have seen animals abandoned and forgotten, left to suffer because they were inconvenient or imperfect. We wanted to know if there were still humans worthy of the old agreements, the old promises between your kind and ours." Ayana felt tears freezing on her cheeks as understanding began to dawn. These weren't malevolent spirits or harbingers of death. They were guardians, protectors of animals who had been testing her resolve and her heart. The killing cold, the broken generator, the isolation, all of it had been a trial to see if she would abandon her charges when staying meant risking her own life. "You have shown us that some humans still remember their obligations," the figure continued. "That some still understand that true strength is measured not by what you can take, but by what you are willing to give." The other figures began to move again, but this time they were walking toward the shelter, and as they passed Ayana, each one touched her gently on the shoulder. Where they touched her, warmth spread through her body, driving out the numbing cold and filling her with energy she hadn't felt in days. The last figure, the one who had spoken, paused in front of her and reached up to lower its hood. The face beneath was that of an old Yakut woman, weathered and kind, with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. "Your grandmother Yekaterina sends her love," she said with a smile. "She says you learned her lessons well." Ayana gasped, recognizing the face from old photographs, from stories passed down through generations. This was her great-great-grandmother, the one who had survived famines and wars, who had passed down the knowledge of living in harmony with the harsh realities of their homeland. But before she could speak, the figure had moved past her and through the door of the shelter, along with the other three spirits. Inside the building, Ayana found a scene that filled her with wonder and relief. The temperature was rising rapidly, not from any mechanical source but from a warmth that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The animals were stirring, lifting their heads, and beginning to move around their enclosures with energy they hadn't shown in days. Fresh water had appeared in their bowls, unfrozen and clean, and she could smell the scent of warm food coming from the storage room. But most amazingly, the animals were no longer afraid or desperate. They were calm, content, and when they looked at her, their eyes held a recognition and gratitude that went beyond the simple appreciation of a pet for its caretaker. They looked at her the way family looks at family, with complete trust and unconditional love. Nanook had left his cage, the door somehow now standing open, and he approached her without fear or aggression. For the first time in the 8 years she had known him, he allowed her to touch him, pressing his scarred head against her hand in a gesture of absolute acceptance. Around the room, the other animals were settling into peaceful sleep, and she realized that they would be safe now, protected by something far more powerful than generators or heating systems. As dawn broke over Batagay, bringing with it the first hints that the unprecedented freeze was beginning to break, Ayana understood that her life had been fundamentally changed. She had been tested in the most extreme circumstances possible and had discovered reserves of courage and love she never knew she possessed. More importantly, she had been recognized by the old spirits, marked as someone worthy of their protection and guidance. Victor found her 3 days later when he was finally able to return to the village, expecting to find tragedy but instead discovering a miracle. The shelter was warm and comfortable, all the animals healthy and content, and Ayana herself glowing with a peace and strength that seemed to radiate from within. She never told him about the shadow figures or the tests she had endured, knowing that some experiences are too profound and sacred to be shared with those who aren't meant to witness them. But she did tell him about her decision to expand the shelter, to take in more animals that others had given up on, and to train a new generation of volunteers who understood that caring for the helpless wasn't just a job or a hobby, but a sacred responsibility that connected them to something larger than themselves. The animals at the shelter thrived under her care, and word spread throughout the region about the woman who could heal the most traumatized and aggressive creatures, who never gave up on an animal no matter how hopeless its situation seemed. People began bringing her the hardest cases: dogs that had been abused, cats that had been abandoned, wild animals that had been injured and couldn't be released back into nature. And Ayana accepted them all, because she had learned that true heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues witnessed by crowds. It's about showing up every day for those who can't protect themselves, about choosing love over convenience, and about understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence, witnessed only by the spirits who guard the hearts of all living things. What moments of quiet heroism have you witnessed in your own life? Share your stories in the comments below, and do want to forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of human courage and compassion that remind us what we truly capable of when we choose to put love above everything else.